All right, so we'll start with an overview of our presentation today. We've got a lot to get through. First, we'll give a little introduction of MOD and what we do. Then we'll give an overview of your legal obligations regarding hosting accessible events and meetings. We'll go over starting with event publicity and registration, where it all begins. We'll talk about some things to look for when selecting accessible event locations, in-person venues, and also virtual event platforms. Then we'll cover some special considerations for hybrid events, which I know people are excited about. How to provide reasonable accommodations and a process for that. Some notes on effective communication at events, including captioning and ASL. And then some resources for more information, and hopefully we'll have time for a live Q&A. Next slide. So we'll start with our introduction. Next slide. So just some background on MOD. So MOD is a small state government office. We provide information, guidance, and training on disability-related civil rights and architectural access. So what that means is we help people understand their rights and obligations under disability laws and how they apply to different situations so they can better assert their rights and comply with the law. So there's a whole maze of disability laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we'll talk a lot about today, that can be hard to navigate. And MOD is here to help people understand all of those laws, which ones apply to them and how they apply to different situations as well. Notably, we are not an enforcement agency and we don't provide any financial assistance or direct services. So we're really just here to provide information about the laws and what they mean for you. Next slide. I'll pass over to Julia.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Julia O'Leary. I am the General Counsel here at Mass Office on Disability. I am a white woman with blonde hair and a navy blue blazer. So this presentation is aimed at state and local government entities, which includes municipalities, town hall, libraries, work meetings. We're also sort of going to address places that serve the public, so places of public accommodation, if we're talking in the terms of the ADA. So this might include, say, a nonprofit fundraiser, a conference, and we're going to cover both in-person events and virtual events, hybrid events. So a little bit of everything this afternoon. We want to sort of focus on three major accessibility considerations. First, selecting an accessible, barrier-free event location or virtual meeting platform. Second, providing reasonable accommodations. And third, effective communication. To kind of get us kicked off, I want to talk about the legal obligations that are relevant here. Both state and federal law require equal access. Massachusetts public accommodation law prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in public places, and the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities by employers, state and local governments, and places of public accommodation. So what this means is that, as covered entities, we need to sort of provide any sort of readily achievable removal of barriers to ensure that our services, our events, our locations are accessible to people with disabilities, whether that's in the physical environment or in a virtual environment. It also means that we need to provide reasonable accommodations or modifications in order to make our events and meetings and other offerings accessible to folks with disabilities. We're going to talk more about what that means as we get into the program today. So I'll turn it over to Lilia.
Thanks, Julia. I see we have some questions coming in already, so just want to remind folks, you're free to submit a question at any time, but we will wait until the end to answer those. So event publicity, where it all begins, letting people know about your event or meeting. So a few things to include in your event publicity, which we'll get into more detail later on in our presentation. But make sure you're including a reasonable accommodation statement. We'll provide an example later on. You also may have noticed this on our registration page for this event. This will give people an opportunity to know how they can request a reasonable accommodation for your event. You also want to include information about how to get there if it's an in-person event. We'll talk about that and things to look for, but public transportation, parking information, think of all the ways that people may get to your event and make sure they have the information they need to prepare ahead of time. Include information about any accessibility features you'll be providing, including ASL, cart, or separate room, as well as any limitations of your venue. So be honest about any kind of accessibility limitations so that people can be prepared ahead of time. Any presentation materials should be sent in advance and should be accessible. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And tech support information is always helpful for virtual events. I do want to put a note here about event flyers. This is something that I see people using a lot, and I want to give a warning that flyers are generally inaccessible and usually not necessary. So these days, a lot of event publicity happens in a digital environment, on social media or email. And for those mediums, just plain text usually works best. It's easier to share, easier to access for people who use screen readers. And if you're putting a flyer together, oftentimes it'll flatten the text so it just appears as an image, which is often then completely inaccessible for screen reader users and can be difficult to read. The text sometimes comes out blurry or smaller. So really text is the way to go. If you are using an event flyer, maybe you have a physical bulletin board or something like that. It's nice to include a QR code. It's a good way to link to a digital version of your event publicity, which may be more accessible, for example, for people who use screen readers. If you do have a QR code, include a written link if you can, so people can access that way if you don't have your phone on you right there. For example, if there's some reason you can't access the QR code. And if you have a digital event flyer, which usually you probably shouldn't, but if you do, then make sure you're including alt text for the image. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Next slide. So your registration form. For small scale meetings, this is probably not something that you do if we're talking about sort of internal staff meetings and things like that. You probably don't have people register for those, which is fine, but you do still want to make sure people are aware of reasonable accommodation information and any accessibility features or limitations for that meeting. For events where you may be using an online registration form, make sure you're using an accessible event platform and an accessible registration page, which we'll get into more detail later on what that means. Include space on your registration form for guests to enter reasonable accommodation requests and any dietary restrictions if you're providing food. So include that, and also make sure you're remembering to check it regularly so you have time to prepare any reasonable accommodations as necessary and engage in an interactive process with registrants to make sure you can get them what they need. So remember also to get their contact information so that you can do that. Next slide. Selecting barrier-free event locations. So we'll talk about in-person events here for this section. So when you're going to pick a venue for your event, you want to really look at it from the perspective of an event attendee. So that should start from the very beginning with publicity and registration, all the way to looking at your venue, how people will get there and how people will experience the event. So as I mentioned, look for accessible parking available nearby, public transportation, look at all the different ways people could access your event, and make sure that those are accessible. Look around inside the event venue itself. Entrances and pathways to move around the event should be clear of obstacles and wide enough, meaning 36 inches or more, to accommodate wheelchairs. So those pathways should be wide, but also need to be clear, which is something that can change. So make sure when you're setting up, if you've got boxes all over the place and things like that, those present an obstacle, make sure you clean that up before attendees come in. If there's any sort of, if you're going to a second floor or any elevated space like a stage, make sure you have ramps or elevators to get there. Something to look out for is there may be elevators inside of the building to get to your room, but is there a step up to get into the building itself? That's something to look for as well. So coming in from outside, even just one step can make it inaccessible. Look at your speaking area, the podium, make sure that that's accessible. So that may mean looking for an adjustable podium if you have a speaker who uses a wheelchair, for example. These are often something you can ask for from the venue, see if they have those available. And signage is really important to show people how to get around within the event itself. So think of all of the places your guests may want to go once they come in, going to check-in, going to the coat check, the bathroom, getting food, and providing labels for those areas and clear ways for people to get there can be really helpful. Signage like that is not accessible to people who are blind or visually impaired. So one option to improve accessibility even more is to have trained sighted guides and ushers on hand to greet people when they come in and help guide people around the event space. And again, think of your entire event space, think of the bathrooms, food, everywhere people may go. If you have resource tables, networking opportunities, you want that to be accessible to all of your guests so they have access to all the information you're providing to everyone. And also in terms of navigating, you want to make sure you have sufficient lighting for people to get around. We had a few comments in our pre-survey about outdoor events, so I'll just say here that signage and the sighted guides can be really helpful and are things that you can bring yourself to the venue. So I think a lot of times when you're thinking about accessible physical spaces, we're thinking about architectural access and things like that, but it also applies to navigating around the space, and you can bring your own signage, you can bring your own guides to make a space that may not seem that accessible at first, more accessible with just things that you bring on your own at low cost. If you are providing food also, then it's good practice to label any allergens and ingredients, which you can often, if you're using a caterer, they're happy to work with you on that. Next slide. All right, so next we're gonna think about the guest once the program actually begins. And if it's a seated event, what kind of seating to look for, what kind of seating your venue offers. So some things to look for when you're touring event venues. It's best to have adjustable seating arrangements as much as you can sort of have control over how seating is set up to be able to move things around in the moment. That's really great. If you have, guests who come in who are wheelchair users, you want them to be able to have choices of where to sit, just like anybody else does. So if you're able to move seats around, that's best. You want accessible tables with ample clear floor space. So wheelchair users and others have room to sit down, fit under the table, and move around. Chairs with back support are really helpful. You may receive requests for this as a reasonable accommodation, but it's best to just provide this for everybody if you can. Again, having sufficient seating for wheelchair users. So you don't want to just sort of have like one space for that you're leaving open for wheelchairs. You want guests who are wheelchair users to be able to have an option of where to sit. They may want to sit in the front, they may want to sit in the back, they may come with a friend who's not a wheelchair user that they want to have seated next to them. So it's really best to have kind of scattered areas where wheelchair users will be able to sit. And another thing to look for in a venue is a separate, smaller room in case guests need a break or just want a place that's not so, doesn't have so much sensory overload. But keep in mind that that separate space should have the same level of access as your main event space. So if you have cart captioning and ASL in your main event room, it should also be available in a separate room, which can mean maybe just like a live stream, a screen in that separate room so that people can access that way. Next slide. So some things to look for in terms of communication access at in-person events. Make sure there's room for ASL interpreters up near the speakers, so guests shouldn't have to kind of look in two different directions to look at the speaker and the ASL interpreter. They should be next to each other and clearly visible. If the speaker is up on a stage, it may make sense to have the ASL interpreter up there as well, so they're visible. It's best to have a large screen for cart captions so that they're clearly visible to everyone, and that is best to have also near the ASL interpreters so people aren't having to divide their attention in case they want to make use of both the ASL and cart. Look for a space that has a good microphone and PA system. If your space has an AV team in-house, that's best. So that can be really helpful. So you don't have to worry about that as an event planner on the day of. There should be sufficient microphones for all of your speakers, including if you have like a question and answer session or input from the audience. It's best to have a microphone for them. FM system or other assisted listening technology available. Some venues have this provided already, so it's good to ask about that when you're looking for a space. And walk around the room. If you can, test out the sound while you're there. Make sure that the sound is clear throughout the room. There's not too much echoing and background noise. So particularly if you are going to have a lot of guests, or if you'll be live streaming an event, like a hybrid event, you want to be kind of wary of spaces with really high ceilings and things like that. So pay attention to those. And also another thing you can kind of bring with you to make a space more accessible is bringing along notepads and pens for short or basic communication. So if you have, for example, a check-in table for guests to come to, have your staff there, have a notepad and pen on hand. If you're trying to communicate with somebody who doesn't speak, or that's just an easier way of communicating with them, it's good to have that kind of readily available. Next slide. So definitely think about your emergency procedures. Hopefully you won't need to implement them, but your emergency procedures should also be accessible to all of your guests. And so this is also information that you should provide in your event publicity, and also best to do a verbal reminder at the program start and after any breaks. So make sure there are wheelchair accessible exit routes, meaning you have wide ramps, doorways, and hallways so people can get out easily. Emergency communication should be accessible, so look for visual and audible alarms, written instructions, sign language interpreters available, and included in the process for planning, so that you can get best practices for making sure everyone's included and safe in the event of an emergency. There should also be assistance for individuals with mobility-related disabilities, so you can designate staff or volunteers to assist individuals who may need assistance evacuating the building. So maybe the people who were serving as sighted guides that we talked about earlier to navigate people around the event space can also be available in the event of an emergency. And again, clear signage should include clear signage to accessible exit routes. Next slide, and I'll pass it to Julia.
Thanks, Lilia. So we're going to talk next about selecting barrier-free virtual event platforms. So where do you start with this? You want to, ask for an accessibility statement from the provider of the platform. So if that's Microsoft, if it's Zoom, if it's WebEx, if it's Google Meets, you should be able to either look up or ask them to provide an accessibility statement that includes an outline of the platform's accessibility features and what compliance standards that platform meets. If you're having trouble finding it or understanding it, customer support should be able to help you understand what different accessibility features are available. And different platforms are going to have slightly different ways of accessing different accessibility features. Also, they change over time. So, new accessibility features are often coming out. So I don't want to be too prescriptive here, but those are kind of good ways to get some insight into what features might be available. Rob, did you have anything you wanted to add on this one?
Yep. Hello, everyone. It's Rob Dias with MOD. I would say that you want a vendor that's going to be kind of transparent and upfront with their accessibility statement or the accessibility of their platform. Generally, if there's no information online, that's generally not a good sign. That may indicate that they're kind of not familiar with accessibility, or they at least haven't kind of prioritized that. So, just be wary of certain platforms and software providers that aren't transparent with their accessibility and how users can interact with their tools.
You also want to think about the platform's compatibility with ASL and CART. You want to make sure that ASL interpreters are visible both in live meetings and in recordings. One way to do that is to spotlight them. You can also make them a co-host, and which will let them sort of spotlight and pin themselves. You want to think about how you're going to ensure a smooth transition from one interpreter to the next. ASL interpreters are really pro at this, and so it's really helpful to get their feedback about what is going to work best for them and kind of follow their lead, but sort of keep that communication open and make sure that you're talking about how that flow is going to work. Make sure that you do a sound check so that the speakers have clear audio. That's going to ensure that CART and ASL interpreters are both capturing what's actually being said. I was at a training earlier in the year where there was live captioning, which is great, but because of the speaker's style, he spoke really quickly. The CART interpreter couldn't catch a lot of what he was saying, both because he was speaking really quickly and the audio quality in the room was poor. And so they were paying for a CART interpreter to type inaudible over and over again, which is really too bad because it undercut the accessibility of that presentation. So make sure that you are directing any speakers to speak slowly and clearly, and that you are making sure that that audio is a good enough quality that your interpreters, your CART reporter, and also your audience can hear you well. It's really helpful to integrate CART directly into the platform. Most CART reporters can help you figure out the logistics of that. So talk to them, have back and forth conversations with them about what works best. They can make recommendations. We do not recommend automatic captioning, particularly for important meetings and events. Automatic captioning does not have the same accuracy and quality as live CART reporting, and is not necessarily going to provide full access to folks with communication access needs. So if someone is asking for CART captioning, there is probably a reason that that works best for them. And especially if there's a sort of like, town meeting or kind of large, important event, you're going to want to provide meaningful access through, a professional like a CART reporter. And, it's really important to think about communication access, not only in the live event, but also in recording. So while you may not need to have an ASL interpreter or a CART reporter to provide communication access to an attendee at your live event, if you're recording that event, sometimes it can be easier, more efficient to include the ASL and CART captioning in your recording from the get-go rather than going back and remediating it later upon request. So it can be a good idea to think about communication access from the beginning rather than having to add it on later. When you are kind of setting up the logistics of the event, it can be really helpful to do some user testing, little dress rehearsal ahead of time. So you might want to have a screen reader user, someone who's keyboard only, someone who is gonna just call in, test out how the platform works, so you know that it's going to be accessible, and you can think about little quirks that pop up based on the different ways that people are accessing your digital event platform. You might also want to engage an accessibility consultant. If you're a state or local government entity, you can use our statewide contract for accessibility consulting services, which is ITS 61. If you're not state or local government, you could check out that contract for an idea of different vendors in the space, or there's other vendors out there who aren't on state contract that you can use for accessibility consulting services, and they can help you understand the usability as well. Anything you want to add here, Rob?
No, I think that's great.
Okay. So what do you do if you've selected a platform and it isn't accessible, or there are certain features of it that aren't accessible? You're going to want to think about whether or not those inaccessible features are critical for someone to access the event. If the features of the platform aren't critical, just don't use them. So say there is a polling feature that is, not accessible to folks who are keyboard only users. Just don't use that feature. You can continue to use the platform, just figure out how to do that interaction or that poll in a different way. If the feature is critical, you want to think about how, what other options you can offer people in order to allow for effective participation. So this is where creativity kind of comes into play. So for example, Platform X allows presenters to take polls to gather real-time feedback, testing attendees' knowledge or gathering their votes. We're seeing this a lot, I think, at conferences, at presentations these days. It's a really popular feature on a number of the platforms. This is a critical component for participation in your event. However, the polling functionality for Platform X doesn't work with certain assistive technologies. So one solution would be to allow for feedback via alternate methods, such as through the Q&A or the chat box, an email address or a phone number where attendees can call or text in their submission. You will obviously need to monitor those methods in real time to achieve equivalent access. So think about your capacity to do that monitoring as well. If you're offering people a number of ways that they can provide that feedback, think about whether you have the staff to monitor all those forums. And I'll turn it over to Lilia for hybrid events.
Thank you, Julia. So the moment that you've all been waiting for, special considerations for hybrid events. Let's bring it all together. Next slide. All right, so in general, if your hybrid events are a wonderful option to give your guests different options for participating. So this can generally make events more accessible just in and of itself by providing both options for attending. However, you should keep in mind that in-person and virtual attendees should be able to equally enjoy and participate in your event or your meeting. So what does this mean? It means you should follow all the best practices that we just covered for both for in-person events and for virtual events. So make sure you're doing everything that we've covered there. I'll put in a plug here. We'll mention this at the end of the presentation, but MOD just published a new page on our website for tips for hosting accessible events and meetings. So with a lot of the information in this presentation, and it includes checklists that you can just take and save. So things to look for in an in-person venue, things to look for on virtual platforms, and then these considerations for hybrid events. So make sure you're going through those checklists for both. And then I think the thing that can be really difficult to think through for hybrid events is if your event includes any kind of networking or interactive components, figuring out how to make that successful for your virtual attendees, so they're not sort of left out and not getting the same level of enjoyment as your in-person attendees. So some of the things I've seen work is providing some prompt questions. So if you have, for example, like 30 minutes at the beginning of your event where your in-person attendees will be mingling and walking around and networking with each other, you can provide the same sort of thing for virtual attendees, knowing that they might need a little more prompting than your in-person attendees will. So providing some questions on screen and in the chat if you're in a platform like Zoom, giving them some questions to prompt some conversation and options for people to talk both privately or in the group. So asking people to introduce themselves or mention where they work or what they do, or if something that they're looking for, if they're looking for some kind of professional development and they want to throw it out there and see if there's somebody at the event who can help them. That's something I've seen people do. And it's also important to offer multiple options for participation. So for example, like in this meeting, we've got the Q&A for you all to submit questions, but we also have the hand raise feature in case that Q&A is not accessible to people, and then you can ask your question verbally. You may also want to explore setting up a voicemail box so that people can call in and submit a question. If you're doing like a live Q&A, just keep in mind that if your virtual attendees and in-person attendees are able to submit a question live, anyone who's using a voicemail should be able to do that as well. They shouldn't have to like submit it ahead of time. And again, another reminder, just anywhere that people will be speaking, if you have ASL and CART, they should be provided anywhere people will be speaking. So this is particularly important to keep in mind. For example, if you have breakout rooms in a virtual event, then often you'll have the ASL and CART in the main room. But if you are recording breakout rooms, or if you have attendees who are deaf or hard of hearing and require ASL and CART, then you want that to be available to them in any kind of breakout rooms as well. Next slide. Live streaming. So for live streaming an in-person event to be available to virtual attendees, it's really important that you have clear sound and video, which can get a little bit tricky. So something to look for in addition to everything else we mentioned for an in-person venue is to make sure they're really equipped for hybrid events. So if possible, you want to consult with your venue's audiovisual team. You want to ask them if they have audio inputs directly in that they can put directly into a virtual meeting for optimal sound. So for really small scale meetings, it might be okay to just have one microphone, and virtual attendees will be able to hear everyone. But usually if you're getting to any more than like 3 people, then you'll want a more sophisticated sound system where you're able to connect audio directly in, and any virtual attendees have that same level of sound clarity that people in the room would have. Virtual attendees should have equal access to the full program. So again, if you have a networking component or anything like that, they should have access to that opportunity as well. And a clear view of the ASL interpreter and speakers. So in some cases, this may mean having the ASL interpreter have a separate camera on them, so they show up in like their own Zoom box. If you have a camera on the speaker, but it's kind of far away and you're trying to fit both the ASL interpreter and the speaker in the same frame, then sometimes that can be inaccessible, hard for them to see. So keep that in mind and test all of this out. Do a sound check, meet with your venue, make sure they're equipped, and do a practice run to make sure that everything looks good, both for in-person attendees and on the virtual side. You don't want to neglect either one of your audiences. Next slide.
All right, now we're going to talk about providing reasonable accommodations. This is Julia again. My clicker works. All right. So what is a reasonable accommodation? It's really any change that you make to your program or service in order to make it accessible to a person with a disability. So that's a pretty broad definition, and we're going to go over some examples. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you need to provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities to allow them to access your your services if you are a public entity or a place of public accommodation. And so, one example of this is Dale is attending a day-long conference where lunch is provided. Because of Dale's disability, he's unable to serve himself. So he needs help getting lunch from his buffet, and he asks for a reasonable accommodation to that effect. So the event organizer should designate a specific employee to meet Dale and assist him with getting lunch from the buffet. This probably isn't going to be considered sort of unduly burdensome to the event organizer. They probably have a lot of employees on staff for the event. And so taking, 15, 20 minutes of one staff person's time to help Dale through the buffet line is probably not going to be unduly burdensome. And that's really what the event organizer would need to show to deny that accommodation request. Keep in mind that the event organizer is also responsible for the financial cost of making their event accessible. So they cannot sort of add a surcharge to the ticket price for someone who is requesting reasonable accommodations. That is illegal. So another example of a reasonable accommodation, Marcia is attending a workshop at her local senior center. She has a learning disability and finds it helpful to review written materials ahead of time. So the workshop organizer should send her the materials ahead of the event. How far ahead of time is reasonable is going to depend both on when the materials are finalized and how long Marcia needs to review them. So if the event materials are done ahead of time, maybe a week ahead of time, but she says she only needs like a day or two to review them, you don't necessarily, you kind of can work out on an individual basis when and how you're going to get her those materials. And this shows, not every reasonable accommodation is going to come with a cost. Some of them are really simply just sort of providing materials ahead of time, moving chairs around. It doesn't have to be expensive, though you are sort of responsible for budgeting for accessibility. You also really should include a reasonable accommodation statement in your invitations and in your event notices. Lilia had mentioned this earlier in the program. Here's an example of language that you could use. So ABC does not discriminate on the basis of disability. If you require a reasonable accommodation because of a disability, please contact Tom Sawyer at this phone number. And if you have a designated ADA coordinator, that is the person who you should list there. If you don't have a designated ADA coordinator because you're not required to, then pick a responsible employee who is sort of aware that they're going to be in charge of handling accessibility at the event. And make sure that they have sort of basic training and understanding of the ADA requirements so that they can be effective in that role. So some very simple process or checklist for reasonable accommodations. Make sure that you're listing that ADA coordinator contact information or the contact information of a responsible person in your organization on invitations and event notices. Make sure that you have an internal process for tracking requests that are received and granted, and that tracking system is kept confidential. And make sure that you have a designated person who's going to be at the event the day of to coordinate any accommodations that need to happen and need coordination at the event itself. So that doesn't necessarily have to be the ADA coordinator. That doesn't mean the ADA coordinator needs to attend every event. But if someone, for example, needs to be directed to a specific seat at the venue, make sure that someone knows that and can help them with that. Or make sure that someone is there to make sure that the room is set up appropriately, and can be on hand to answer any questions. In terms of the tracking process, it doesn't have to be particularly formal. It can be as simple as a spreadsheet. You just want to know what was requested, what was granted, and what the plan is for implementing. And if necessary, sort of who's the responsible person to make sure that that happens. All right, we're going to talk about effective communication now, which, based on the questions in the Q&A, it seems like you've got some burning questions. So hopefully this will be a really helpful section for y'all. Sort of some tips for speakers. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Speak into the microphone and limit background noise as much as you can to make sure that your voice is clear, both for attendees and for any interpreters or CART reporters who are providing communication access at your event. It's very important to speak slowly and clearly. You don't need to speak loudly or to shout. Diction is more important than volume in terms of communication access most of the time. It's helpful to identify yourself and give a visual description. So you'll notice that Lilia and I do that at the beginning of the presentation, and then when we switch speakers, we sort of verbally cue that we're switching speakers. It's very helpful to provide presentation materials in advance, whether or not people ask for it. It's really helpful to folks with a variety of disabilities to be able to look through the slides ahead of time in case they are deaf and hard of hearing and rely on communication access like CART and ASL. It can be hard to read the screen, read a slide on the screen and look at the speaker and look at the ASL interpreter or the CART transcript. So being able to review the slides ahead of time can be really helpful. Can also be really helpful for people who are blind, who might want to read any alternative text on any images that are in your presentation ahead of time. Also folks who have various learning disabilities, it can be really helpful to review the slides ahead of time in order to sort of understand the flow of a presentation better. If you are speaking virtually, use an accessible background. Your background should be free of clutter, with high color contrast between you and the background. You'll notice we have a very boring virtual background. Sort of a description of it would be we have like a bluish gray background, and then up in the corner of the screen we have our Mass Office on Disability logo, and our website URL, mass.gov/MOD beneath it. Pretty straightforward background, pretty good contrast between the background and the speaker. You'll also want to make sure that you're thinking about contrast in any slides that you're presenting, and sort of keeping your presentation high contrast and visually clear. When should you book CART and ASL for your event. These are different types of communication access. So for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with CART and ASL, CART is real-time live transcription. So we have a human being here who is transcribing what I am saying into a live transcript that you can view either as a transcript or as closed captions. And then an ASL interpreter, as you can see on the screen, we have an ASL interpreter here who is translating what I am saying into American Sign Language. So if someone is requesting CART or ASL, it's probably going to be required to provide communication access. I think it's pretty hard to say that that is an unreasonable request. These services do come at a cost. They are not incredibly expensive, and someone who needs one or the other might not actually be effectively accommodated, by an alternative. So if someone who is deaf requests ASL, it isn't necessarily sufficient to say, well, just use the closed captioning that we're providing, because many people who speak ASL as a first language aren't necessarily comfortable or fluent enough in written English for that to be effective as an accommodation for them. Similarly, many late deafened people never learn ASL, and so for them, captions are going to be more effective. It's required if someone is asking for it because they need it as a reasonable accommodation. It's best practice to include CART and ASL when you have sort of large events for indefinite audiences that are likely to include people with communication access needs. So when we host an event like one of our quarterly teas, we always book both CART and ASL because we assume that people who are deaf or hard of hearing or who otherwise need communication access are going to be coming to our event. And so we want to make it a welcoming event for them. We want them to have access and be included. So we always book it. Or if you know that your audience is going to include people who are deaf. So an example of that would be if you have, say, a hearing in a zoning board, a zoning board hearing for a project where you know that the abutters are deaf and speak ASL. You're going to want to make sure that you book ASL for that, so that if that person, if the abutters come to that meeting, they're going to have communication access. And for CART and ASL, it's really easy. It's much easier if you book those services as far in advance as you can, as soon as you've scheduled your meeting, to make sure that someone is available, because there are limited numbers of CART reporters and ASL interpreters, especially if you need someone who is sort of specially qualified. Maybe they need to sort of have legal certification or medical. That can even limit the pool of folks further. Also, keep in mind that if you are recording an event, you're going to put it up on your website, you're going to put it up on your YouTube page, your audience is large and indefinite. So you might not need to have CART or ASL for that, at first, but you would need to remediate it upon request. And so you might want to consider whether just adding that communication access up front is going to be more efficient and more inclusive. When you are including CART and ASL in events, it's great to use the MCDHH, Mass Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing's interpreter referral service. That's a free referral service that will connect you to an interpreter or a CART reporter that you do need to pay for. But if you're sort of trying to figure out where, how do I book someone, that's a great place to do it. There's also vendors who provide video remote interpreting. There are limitations to that that we don't necessarily have time to get into today, but keep in mind that you want to make sure that you're providing equal access, and sometimes there's limitations for access when someone is relying on video remote interpreting and everyone else is in the room together. It can get hard to sort of look in two directions at once. There's also issues around dialect. Some tips for working with communication access providers. It's really helpful to send the agenda, speaker names, any slides that you're planning on presenting in advance so that they kind of know what types of words, what kind of language you're going to be using, and they can prepare. As I said before, it's helpful if you speak slowly and clearly so that they have time to interpret or to transcribe what you're saying. And when you're using a virtual platform, it's really helpful to make the ASL interpreters co-host. That lets them spotlight themselves and kind of help you help them.
Hi, just jumping in to add, if your program includes video or music, then you should let them know about that ahead of time as well. If you can send the video in advance, that's also helpful.
Yes, good point, Lilia, and let them know whether you're expecting them to interpret or transcribe that video. So that's important information for them. One other point that we wanted to kind of address on this, if you're a small business and you are hearing this and thinking, how am I ever going to afford to provide CART or ASL for small businesses? There is a disabled access credit, so you can get a tax credit for providing communication access. So keep that in mind. That is available through IRS Form 8826, which I think we have linked in our resources at the end of the presentation. Accessible PowerPoint slides. So just some top tips. Use unique titles for each slide. Titles serve as sort of an outline of the document for someone who's using a screen reader. So if they want to sort of go to a specific slide, it's easier to navigate that PowerPoint deck when every slide has a unique title. They can jump to the section that they want to go to. Use image and audio descriptions for any visually presented material, whether that's an image or a video. If you have a lot of shapes and images on a slide, first think about, is there another way to convey that meaning? And then second, you can group those together and use one set of alternative text for that and for the entire grouped image, which makes it a lot less busy when a screen reader user is reading that alternative text. It's also really important to use high contrast color schemes. Think about this not only in terms of just sort of plain color, but also if you're superimposing text over images, make sure that there is sufficient color contrast across the entire image that you have text superposed over. It can be really helpful instead of sort of having text over an image to put a background to the text so that it's sufficient color contrast throughout the entire text box. Make sure that there aren't errant bullet points. This is something that Rob always gets annoyed at me for doing, because each bullet point is going to read bullet. And so if it says bullet and there's no text, it can be confusing for someone reading that slide. Check the reading order and use a built-in accessibility checker. These tips, we said PowerPoint, but these apply to any sort of presentation platform. Rob, anything I should have added in here?
Not so much added. I just kind of do want to point out the accessibility checker, especially in Microsoft products. It is something that you can use while you're working, so it's not something that you just need to check at the end. So you could, have the tool running, and it will alert you to any errors or warnings as you work, which kind of may be a better workflow than sort of addressing potential accessibility issues at the end. But thanks.
Thanks, Rob.
Hi, it's Lilia. I'm jumping in again. Someone just asked about an example of a good PowerPoint slide. So I'm going to toot our horn here and say it really is best practice to just keep it as simple as possible. So something we did here at MOD is the slides that we're using for this presentation use a template that we developed a while back, and now we can just reuse it for all presentations that we do. You'll notice there's not a lot of bells and whistles. It's got large text, it uses a sans serif font, and there's limited use of images or like shapes and kind of stylistic elements like that. So that really makes it more accessible and a lot easier if you're converting it to a PDF or something like that. There's not as much to mitigate. So I would recommend if you just kind of create one design that you like, and then you can just use that template going forward, and you know that it's accessible for the most part, and then you're able to use your branding and everything as well.
Yeah, it's important too that, you can have your logo, you can have your deck look pretty and be accessible. It's not an either or proposition. When you are showing videos or sharing a screen, it is best practice to use audio description for videos where that aren't sort of narrated. So if you have visually presented material in that video, adding a voiceover that describes what's being visually presented is really important in order to ensure access for people who are blind or low vision. It's also important if you are screen sharing, because when you're sharing a screen, the accessibility features of your PowerPoint, of whatever you're presenting visually, isn't going to come through in that screen share. So it's helpful to share your materials in advance and to describe any visual elements verbally and to be, relatively specific. So if I had, some images on this screen, I would visually describe those images as they are relevant to the presentation. When you if you have a video, be aware of written text in the video that isn't spoken aloud. Add that voiceover of audio description to read that text out loud. It's really helpful to name who's speaking. Also, if you're sort of giving a demonstration of how to use a website, how to use a computer program, don't say click here as you're sort of giving that demo. Give verbal cues so that people know, what actions they are taking, because, you know, pointing to the screen and saying, as you can see, X, Y, Z is not going to be helpful for someone who, in fact, cannot see. All right. Rob, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think if you're, if you have a video that you're playing and, obviously you want to include closed captions, but keep in mind any relevant noises that may be taking place in the video that you're going to want as part of the closed caption transcript. So if a telephone ringing or if there's alarms going off or someone shouting in the background, so keep that in mind as part of the closed captioning. It's not just for content that's spoken, it's also for any relevant audible noises.
Thanks, Rob. All right, we have put together some resources for you. If you registered ahead of time for this event, you should have gotten a copy of this deck already. And I believe that it will also be shared after the presentation. So you'll be able to click on these links that we have put in here for you. So we have, as Lily had mentioned earlier in the presentation, guidance on our website, tips for hosting accessible events and meetings. That includes some really helpful checklists that you can use as you're planning your events to kind of go through different accessibility features that you want to consider. We've also linked to some information about your legal obligations, the Massachusetts Public Accommodations Law and the Americans with Disabilities Act. We also have a checklist for readily achievable barrier removal for your in-person events, and how to guidance on how to guide a person with vision loss. If you're having an in-person event and you want to provide guidance assistance to folks who are blind or low vision. For virtual events, we have linked to the Web Accessibility Evaluation Guide. We also have linked to some examples of accessibility statements. So if you are looking at the accessibility statement of your digital platform, give you some idea about what you might be looking for. We've also linked to our statewide contract for accessibility consulting services. Again, that's available to state agencies and municipalities, but it might be helpful just to peruse if you're a private business as well, give you some ideas of vendors that are out there. We also provide a link to Mass Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing's interpreter referral service. Great place to go if you need to book an interpreter or a court reporter for your event. We included some best practices for accessible PowerPoint presentations, audio description resources, and best practices for accessible screen sharing. Finally, money. We included information for municipalities. We have a municipal ADA improvement grant. This funds capital projects related to accessibility by municipal governments. So if you want to make your meeting spaces in your city or town more accessible to people with disabilities, this would be a great way to do that. We provide planning grants to do an evaluation and transition, a self-evaluation and transition plan. And then we also provide project grants to accomplish the sort of projects outlined in that transition plan. We also have a link to the tax benefits for businesses who have employees with disabilities or who provide accessibility services. And finally, this is how you contact us. Turn it over to you, Lilia.
Thank you, Julia. We will now head into our questions. If you do have to hop off, when you click out of here, a survey will pop up. Please fill that out so we can improve our trainings going forward. This is our quarterly tea. We host these webinars once a quarter, and the topics are chosen based on the feedback we get from you in the surveys about what you're interested in learning more about. I'm also going to put in another plug for that tips for hosting accessible events page on our website. I'll include that in the follow-up email as well. That has easy checklists for things to look for. We've covered a lot of information here, so those are good to kind of have on hand moving forward, and also some more deep details on that page than we were able to get to today. All right. Our first question, how far in advance is considered a reasonable accommodation for a public program, for example, ASL interpretation? So how much notice should people give?
I can take this, Julia.
Okay.
This is Julia. I think it needs to be a reasonable amount of time. And that's going to depend kind of on your business model. Usually for booking interpreters or court reporters through MCDHH, you need at least 2 weeks lead time to do that. So I think having, think about sort of your operational needs and tailor the lead time that you're going to ask for from people to match that. So I'm not going to give you necessarily a fixed number of days in advance that you need to give people to ask for an accommodation, but kind of think about your operational needs, your workflow, and what a reasonable amount of notice for you would be. And there are some accommodation requests that you can definitely respond to last minute. So think about that too. We often put in language like, please submit requests for reasonable accommodations by a certain date, but accommodations requested after that will be considered, but we might not be able to provide them.
Julia, it's Rob. I just also want to add, I know Lilia touched upon this before in terms of event publicity is, indicate what accommodations you are providing by default. So if ASL and CART will be provided, make sure you're mentioning that. But also you want to probably provide a level of detail of what type of activities will be happening at the event. So your potential attendees are more informed as to what to expect, and they can sort of get a better sense of what potential accommodations they may need. So just make sure you're just providing enough information that users can reach out, because you may get requests for things that aren't relevant to the event. So the more information you can put out there, if you're having breakout sessions, different rooms, the more informed the public will be in order to determine what accommodations they may need for equal participation.
Thank you. Next question, does the host pay for the ASL interpreter, or does the person needing the interpreter? There are budget implications.
This is Julia. I think I mentioned this during the presentation, but it is the obligation of the host to pay for the reasonable accommodations. I mean, you cannot impose a surcharge on the attendees for requesting reasonable accommodations. So you need to factor that into your budget for the event. And like we had mentioned, if you are a small business, there are some tax breaks associated with providing reasonable accommodations.
And it's Rob again. Julia, just for point of clarification as well, if can you speak to you're hosting the event and you're going to a venue, it's not the obligation of the venue provider to provide sort of ASL or CART. It's the entity putting on the event.
Yeah, unless you would put it in your hosting contract, but yeah, it would be your, as the event organizer, it's your obligation to provide communication access. You definitely could contract with the event is with the venue to provide that, but the obligation is on you.
Mhm.
I think we've got a lot of folks from libraries on the webinar today. Someone asked, is a public library considered part of local government?
For purposes of Title II of the ADA, yes. It's also considered a place of public accommodation for Massachusetts public accommodation law. So you do need to comply with both the ADA and the public accommodation law.
Does that, and this is my personal follow-up question, does that mean that public libraries are eligible for the municipal ADA grant?
I think so, yeah.
Thank you. We've got a couple hands raised, so I'm going to call on some of you. Please be sure to keep your question brief and on topic. I will say our contact information is on screen. I'll put it in the chat as well. If you want to talk about a specific situation or get more in depth about something, then you're welcome to call us and we can discuss with you. Lucy, I'm going to allow you to unmute.
Thank you so much. I thought you did such a thorough, comprehensive job of covering the accommodation needs of people with like certain disabilities. Like you covered visual, auditory, physical, briefly touched on cognitive and intellectual. And I wanted to just bring up environmental disabilities. Often because it's such a stigmatized group, we're left out and of inclusivity and we're denied accommodations. But I have two really nice examples from an event at MIT and a book group at the Boston Public Library, just for wording, if anyone wants a little bit of inspiration. Is that okay?
Yeah, I believe you should be able to share things in the Q&A if you want to post it there.
So I have an environmental disability. I have chemical sensitivity. So if I'm around perfume, I get migraines and worse symptoms. And I went to an event at MIT in 2019, and on their invitation, they said, as much as possible, we will have a scent and fragrance-free event. Please help us by not wearing any perfumes, colognes, or scented lotions. And then I go to a book group and the invitation says, to accommodate our participants with sensitivities to fragrances, please do not wear perfume, cologne, or other strongly scented products to book club. And for me, that's accessibility. That means that I can go. It doesn't guarantee that people won't wear products, but it cuts down the toxin level to a point where if I do go, I can probably stay the whole time instead of leaving halfway through. Or if I go, I'm not sick for 3 days after. Because chemical sensitivities mimic allergies in that rain barrel effect of a limit that you can meet before you have symptoms. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And there's a misconception about that. Some people don't want to ask participants at a meeting to not wear perfume because they think, oh, someone will be wearing perfumed hairspray, so it won't matter. But it really does matter to our ability to go to events. And then the other thing that we need is fragrance-free restrooms. The sprays that are used in restrooms are some of the most toxic. So when you say we will be providing disability accessible restrooms or wheelchair accessible restrooms, to include fragrance free, and then to have a sign on the bathroom door that says this is a fragrance-free restroom, please help us by not using fragrance products in this space, so that someone doesn't go in and apply their perfume in that room. And then
Thank you. Yeah. We have a lot of questions to get to, so I want to make sure everybody has time. Did you have a question?
no, just that you had left out a disabled group.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think that's a good point. That's why you want to make sure you're including the reasonable accommodation statement and opportunities for people to ask for reasonable accommodations. The disability community is a wide, diverse community, and people have all kinds of different needs. So you want to make sure there's an opportunity for people to share their needs with you. And make sure you're considering all aspects of your event, like she mentioned, the bathroom, in addition to the main event space and all of that. Our next question is, if the hosting agency requests cart in advance of the event and the request is not filled, are automatic captions okay in that situation? Julia, do you want to take that?
So this happens sometimes. I would use your judgment about what kind of event it is. In the past, depending on the kind of event, we have rescheduled events where we felt that providing live transcription was really important in order to provide equal access. Or think about, it's called a reasonable accommodation, right? So if you can't provide a CART reporter because you're unable to book one, or you can't provide an ASL interpreter because you're unable to book one, you have a couple different options. You can reschedule, you can come up with an alternative. And I would recommend talking to the person with a disability who's asked for that service to figure out what alternative is going to work best for them. That might mean that automatic captions are okay. It might not. It really depends on the nature of the event and the individual requesting the accommodation. So there isn't sort of black and white answer for that one. Sorry.
Thank you. I can take the next question. So someone asks, how do you make the ASL interpreter show in a Zoom recording? Even when spotlit and using gallery view, they often don't show up. Only those who speaks videos show in the recording, in my experience. So I will say that Zoom, and probably other platforms as well, frequently change their settings, and it's best to connect with the support team of the platform you're using for the most up-to-date information on what is best. Personally, I also spend a lot of time kind of playing around in our different platforms, pushing all the different buttons, trying out different settings to see what works. So we spend a lot of time practicing webinars like this before we actually go live with the real thing. For us here at MOD, when we are recording, what we've learned is to make sure you're doing a local recording rather than recording to the cloud, and make sure that whoever is doing the actual recording, whatever they see on their screen, that is what will come through in the recording. So here we've got shout out to Bill, who's on this Zoom. He's recording for us today. We've got Bill just responsible for that so that he can really monitor his screen and make sure that the captions are showing the whole time. That's another thing. The captions won't show up in your recording if they're not on your screen while you're recording. So you want to make sure you have them turned on the whole time and that you're recording locally, not to the cloud. But again, that's what we're doing right now, but these features change pretty frequently. So make sure you're talking to your support team to make sure you have the most accurate information. Next question. Can you please go over accessibility text in social media posts? Do you know how to use those? I've seen it as an option in Instagram when making a post. Thank you in advance. So I believe you're talking about alternative text or alt text, which is a description of an image that you can write up to provide access to that image for people who are blind or visually impaired or use screen readers. And so I believe all of the major social media platforms at this point have a feature where you can add alternative text. So best practices for alternative text: keep it concise and relevant to what the user needs to know. Like, what is this image trying to convey? That people who can see, what information are they getting that someone who's blind or visually impaired wouldn't get without a written description. So for example, right now we've got on screen a picture of a woman who is sitting at an office desk. She's on the phone, she's smiling, she's got a striped shirt on, she's holding a pen, and it's our contact MOD slide. So in this case, for the alternative text, this image is provided mostly for decoration. I would say, like, it's not really important that she's wearing a striped t-shirt, but the fact that she's in an office setting and she's on the phone, I might mention that because what we're trying to convey here is how to contact MOD, and this gives you kind of like a picture of what we look like and who we are sitting in our office answering your phone calls. Rob, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I would just say, I mean, I'm not a social media user, but be mindful of hashtags when you're doing regular text. Maybe you want to put those sort of at the end, so someone using a screen reader, doesn't have to hear, hashtag this, hashtag that before they get into the relevant information. But again, I'm not a social media person, other than I think my MySpace account may still be active, but that's about it. So.
I'll go looking for that. Yeah, you should be mindful of hashtags. If you do use them, make sure you're using camel case, which is when you capitalize the first letter of each word. If you don't do that, then screen readers can kind of smush everything together and say it all as one word. So camel case is best. Avoid overuse of emojis. That can get annoying for screen reader users. And your alternative text shouldn't be repeating what's in the caption, or sometimes people use it as like a place to just like have some fun, like make a little joke or something, or do like a photo credit. That's not really what it's for. It's to describe the image for people who can't otherwise get meaning from the image. And it's best also to do that within the platform itself. Again, I'm not up to date on this, so it's best to check with the platform, but some of the social media scheduling platforms may have an alt text option, but it won't necessarily go through to the final post. So just make sure you're double checking that everything is actually working. I hope that answers your question. Next question, can you speak to procuring cart in languages other than English? I'm not sure about this one. I don't know if Julia, you have something to share.
I honestly, I'm not sure. I would check with Mass Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing and see if they have feedback about this, because I think that they would be really helpful. So I would recommend reaching out to them.
Someone just asked, why shouldn't we record to the cloud? So I mentioned that when we were going over how to make sure ASL interpretation and captions are coming through in your recording. In my experience, the ASL interpreters didn't always come through when we were recording to cloud, so we record locally. And Zoom may have updated their settings since then. So again, I would check, but that's why we don't do the cloud. Next question, Rob, this might be for you. Any tips for PowerPoints with charts? Sometimes we have to do complex charts that we can't make within the Microsoft Office suite. So we have to make them images. How much alt text do we have to use for those? And if the charts are made in PowerPoint, do they need alt text at all, or will screen readers be able to read them already?
So it depends. If you have a chart and you also have the data represented in text format, sort of on the presentation itself, then that will be sort of the main place where people are getting the actual data from. And the alternative text for the chart could simply be kind of an overview of the chart, whether or not it's a bar chart or a pie chart, and providing some basic information about some of the data points there. You don't have to necessarily display or write down an alternative text every single piece of data point. There's options to sort of link out to an accessible HTML or table of the same data point, or maybe an accessible Excel spreadsheet that you could do, or maybe alongside the chart or in a different slide, providing an accessible table with the same information there. So it's going to depend on the content that you're already providing, sort of in text, as to whether or not how much information you need to provide in the alternative text. There are some potential tricks too you could do, putting a table with the information kind of beneath the chart, and preserving the reading order, and that way someone using a screen reader can kind of hear the table that may be visually hidden. But it's what I would recommend is providing a textual representation of what you're providing visually, because it's not just going to benefit people using screen readers, but anyone that may have cognitive issues, or depending on how big the font is with the chart, they'll be better able to digest the information there. Hope that helps.
Thanks, Rob. How does a person access CART on a Zoom meeting? I've never been able to figure it out over live caption. So we've actually got CART for this meeting here. You can see you should have a captions button in your Zoom menu. So you just click on that and then click show captions, and you should be able to see them. To set up a CART reporter, there's an option in Zoom to enable manual captioning and then set your CART captioner as the captioner. That's how it works in Zoom currently, to my knowledge. Again, check with your platform to make sure you're up to date. Is there any reason we would not be able to host hybrid meetings with ASL interpreters? Are there any best practices, such as the interpreters and deaf or hard of hearing people be on the same platform? For example, all virtual or all in person? Julia, do you want to take that?
Yes. Sorry, this is Julia. Just trying to find my camera button. No, I think that you can definitely make hybrid events work with ASL interpreters and CART. I think it's if you were having an event, I think that it's most helpful to have the ASL interpreter be in person at the event with a separate camera on them for the hybrid audience, and then have, if you're providing CART, the CART is, I think, equally accessible if it's in person or remote. So when we've done hybrid events here at MOD, we'll often have an in-person interpreter and a remote CART reporter. Does that answer the question?
Julia, it's Rob. I just kind of want to add, just in case that's the question. with phrasing. You shouldn't force attendees to, let's say, attend in person because that's the only place that you're providing ASL.
Oh,
So,
right.
whatever, if attendees can join either virtual or hybrid, or in person or virtually, you don't want to provide one method of accessible participation and force your attendees to pick. In case that was the question, again, with
Yeah.
the phrasing, I wasn't just wanted
That's
to
a good
make sure.
point. Thanks.
We had a few questions related to color contrast. So I see Julia put an answer in the Q&A about the recommended color contrast. And someone also shared their personal experience with why this is important for them and their own disability. I will say also there are resources online for checking color contrast. If you're not sure if you have good contrast or not, you can run through a color checker and it will let you know. And I don't think we have that in the slides actually, but we can share that.
We can also pull up a slide on color contrast if you want.
Sure.
See if I can do this elegantly. All right, I think this is showing up.
You see the contact MOD slide still.
How about that? All right. Here's some good guidelines on use of color in PowerPoint slides.
We're still seeing the contact MOD slide. Sorry.
Oh,
you might have to stop sharing and then.
Now is that right?
Oh, there you go.
Okay. So use of color in PowerPoint slides. You want to use some strong color contrast. So the contrast ratio should be at least 4.5 to 1 for normal text, or 3 to 1 for large text. So you can have a little bit less contrast if you have larger text because it's easier to read. For graphics and user interface components, so like form, input, borders, that color contrast ratio can be a little lower as well, 3 to 1. And then I think I had mentioned this verbally, but it's probably helpful to repeat. Be careful about putting text over busy backgrounds because often the busyness of the background is going to undermine the color contrast. So up on the screen, we have two examples. On the left, we have a background image of fall leaves and kind of oranges, reds, browns. Superimposed over that, we have white text that reads fall newsletter, and that's kind of hard to read. The color contrast is not 4.5 to 1 consistently across that text. On the right, we have another example where we have that same background of fall leaves, but in front of the background, we have a brown banner and the text, the white text fall newsletter appears in over that brown banner, and that provides uniform color contrast behind all of the text, makes that text much easier to read. You still get the visual benefit of the pretty visuals, the pretty fall leaves, but it's much easier to read that text and much more accessible. So there's an example.
Thank you. For hybrid events, is it preferable to have ways for virtual folks to interact with in-person folks? In some ways, it can be easier to create the same experience by setting up parallel dialogues, one in person and one online, with both in-person and online moderators, but then you miss out on learning from folks on the opposite platform. So Julia, I don't know if you have something to say here. I would say this is what can be really tricky about hybrid events. It is best if everybody can interact with everybody. If you can do that in a way that is accessible and that you're able to do with the resources that you have. So I think, that suggestion I had of providing prompt questions, you can also have those at the in-person event up on a screen and maybe have somebody read them at a podium. You could have a computer set up so that in-person attendees can come say hello to the virtual attendees, maybe little booths or something like that. I'm glad that you mentioned having in-person and online moderators. I think that's definitely best practice, to have a designated person kind of overseeing each version of the event so that nothing's being neglected and you have people who are kind of in charge of making sure that both in-person and virtual attendees have access to everything. I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I think I agree. It is tricky, but I think those are good. Those are good points, Lilia.
Yeah, I think that's definitely best, and may require some more planning and thinking ahead and designated staff. Next question. I'm trying to visualize how audio description would work when one is showing a video with captions that has a voiceover that does not necessarily describe the image. So I think you're asking if the captions would include the audio description. I'm not sure about that, actually.
I think there's a good, I was going to put a link to a video that we have that I think is a pretty good example of audio description. We have audio description, captioning, and an ASL interpreter all in one video. So I will just put a link to that in answer to that question, if that works.
Thank you. So Julia just posted that YouTube video link in the Q&A, and I can share that in this follow-up email as well. I will just reiterate what we said earlier, some really important kind of main things to keep in mind for audio description. If you have text on screen, that should be read in a voiceover, and you should name who is speaking. Each time somebody comes on screen, the voice changes. I'll let people know who it is. And I think we just have one last question here. I wonder if it's required to include in a flyer that the program has ASL interpretation, even though the online registration page contains this information. I'll give that to Julia, but first I will say, remember my warning about flyers. They're often not necessary and can be inaccessible, so don't use a flyer if you don't need to. Julia.
It's not necessarily required to include that information, but it's certainly helpful and welcoming to. So if you are definitely going to have an ASL interpreter present, it doesn't hurt to let people know, and it might make your event more attractive to folks who are deaf, who would say this signals that this is a welcoming event for me.
All right, thank you, everyone. I think that's all of our questions. So I will send an email with the recording and the slides. Again, a survey will pop up when you close out. Please fill that out with your feedback and let us know what topics you're interested in learning more about in the future. If you have questions about disability-related laws and how they apply to you, you can contact us online. Our online contact form is the best way to get in touch with us, or our phone number is there as well, and we're happy to provide more individualized guidance. So thank you for coming.